or on our live stream. What we're just going to do now, as we've done yesterday and we'll continue to do throughout the Business and Nature Hub, is just to give you a brief wrap-up of what's happened today and then what's going to happen tomorrow as well, some of the sessions that are related to business that you might be interested in joining. This is not changing. So there we go. So we have the agenda from today. So we started this morning with a breakfast briefing, which was Rodrigo just recapping on all of the events from yesterday. And then we moved into a number of sessions. So we had the Biodev session 2030 here at the Business and Nature Hub. We had the Changing the Food System session, the rollout of the TEEB Agri-Food, which was actually a follow-on from a session that we'd had elsewhere in at Congress on one of the central stages earlier in the day. Then this afternoon, we had a talk on the role of the private sector in unlocking biodiversity data, where we were joined by GBIF and a number of other colleagues. And then finally, just about half an hour ago or so, we've just had the Biodiversity Indicators for Site-Based Impacts session, where we talked about the methodology and some of the case studies. So as I mentioned, we had the Biodev 2030 session here this morning at 11 o'clock. So it's quite actually now difficult to read on there. There was a lot of panelists on that particular session. We had members from Uganda, from Madagascar, from Mozambique, from Fiji, all coming to talk about how they're engaging either as part of the private sector themselves or trying to encourage private sector to engage in some of their nature conservation and biodiversity efforts. So the key take-home messages from there were that the Biodev 2030 project was really bringing together skills, knowledge, and people right across various different sectors, both the public, the private, and academia and civil society all together to create some of these projects that were commercially viable. And that one of the key take-homes was that it was very important in some of these rural communities to link biodiversity to people's day-to-day lives. And through doing this, they were able to make it relevant and be able to get the traction that they needed to get these projects to work. They identified that some of these economically productive lands can work really effectively as buffers to natural areas, in particular protected areas. But that protecting biodiversity as a result should be something that can be commercially viable. You can encourage and connect landscapes together, protect some of these protected areas, but also make this, do this in a commercially viable way. They identified that certification was really challenging, particularly when you were talking about smallholders, which were some of the main sort of stakeholders in this project, but that they could group together some of these smallholders to make certification possible, but that realistically adaptation in developing countries are needed to enable some of these certification barriers not to inhibit some of the projects that were going to do some really good work. And one of the good, really key points that we had at the end from one of the members of the panel was that in some of these rural communities, it is women who are the face of biodiversity conservation and therefore really need to be at the forefront of some of the decision-making around these projects. So then we had the Transforming the Food System session here at the Hub, and this had followed on from the central stage session. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join these, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Rodrigo, who's just going to talk through what was covered during those sessions.
As Leo mentioned, this is a follow-up from the center stage session we had earlier today. So this was the flagship topic from today, was food system transformation. We had initially a high-level panel at 11:15 in the center stage, including Johnny Hughes, the CEO from WCMC, Alice from OP2B, which is she's actually from Danone, but has represented this group of companies working on agri and biodiversity in the agri sector, hosted by the WBCD, and also a representative from the Dutch government, and each talking about their perspective on how to transform the agri system. In this session, we covered also the TEEB Agri-Food Initiative, which is applying TEEB, which is the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, in the context of the agricultural systems. They are currently applying develop guidelines and are applying in 7 countries, and intend to have those guidelines published next year. Basically, what we heard is that the agricultural system is broken. Transformation is needed. So from the Dutch government, we heard that they are changing their approach on how they deal with the impacts from agriculture on the ground. So not only relying on models, but actually working on the ground with the farmers to realize what their actual demands. Alice from O2B indicated that advances in the agri-sector in the last 40, 50 years were substantial, but those happens at a cost from the environment, and that this needs to change, and needs to change in the next 10 years. So basically, there's a 10-year agenda that where the whole agri-sector needs to move on and work differently. In the afternoon session, which is basically it was an extended version of the Central Stage 1, we had a full presentation on the guidance that TIB Agri-Food is applying now in 7 countries, including Brazil and others. So it's basically they are rolling out a way for companies to incorporate the way they assess externalities from the agricultural sector within their business, using companies from different stages of the supply chain. We heard from someone from the finance sector, someone from farming, so all the value chain of the agri, it's included. And then this was followed by a panel, including myself, P2B again, and Common Land, which is an organization focused on financing large-scale agricultural projects that are nature positive. And the discussion was in the sense of the need for clear guidance for companies in terms of what to do, the clear metrics and metrics that are applicable and that have a purpose. And that's, I guess, that summarizes it. So basically, we need to transform the food systems, and to do that, we need clear measures and a way for companies to track their progress in this direction.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And yeah, I think it just highlights that there are so many sessions going on that are relevant that you can't possibly keep track of them all. So thanks for going to that one for me, Rodrigo. So this afternoon here at the Hub, we then had this session on the role of the private sector in unlocking biodiversity data. So we were joined by a great panel. So we had Julien Calas from the French Development Agency, Cedric Ilboud from Biotope, Tim Hirsch, the Deputy Director of GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, Stephen Dickinson from Total Energies, and Anne-Sophie Ochambu from the French GBIF node manager. And what we did is we talked about how we can get data from the private sector to be accessible to those who need it in the most sort of cost-effective and time-effective way. And we learned about a lot of the work that's been going on to try and get a lot of this data into GBIF. You can see here that the image on the right-hand side is that from GBIF and their process of how they do this. So they collect data from digitized specimens, observations and surveys from people or from consultants, from literature, from satellite tracking, and also now increasingly becoming a possibility from environmental DNA. And by putting it through this common standard, they're able to then publish it in a way that's accessible and understandable and interpretable to the various different users who might need to access this kind of data, and how that this can then filter down to influence things like the IPBES reports, also feeding into decisions by the CBD, and also into various different other data users. We talked about some of the challenges of how actually this can be done. The time constraints once the process is set up is actually not as challenging as perhaps is perceived. We heard about how a standard template for recording the data can really benefit and speed up this process. And one of the other things is we learned about being clear on who actually owns data before you begin this process. One of the key take-homes there was that, you know, if you write this in from the very beginning, you make it very clear when you write those initial terms of reference and contracts, then it makes this issue of who owns the data and what we can do with it much more easy to tackle when you get to this stage of wanting to make it accessible to more and more people. And one of the things I was struck by as part of this session was that not only is there a huge volume of data being provided, we learned that through this, the data is being used a huge number of times as well. There was over 3,000 downloads of data or accesses of data from a single company, and this was included in 10 different citations of scientific work as a result. So we can really see that there's a benefit coming out of all this data being generated. It's not just being put out there for no one to use. And then finally, this evening, we've been having the Biodiversity Indicators for Site-Based Impact session, which has just finished a few moments ago. So here we covered the new methodology. This was something that was launched in 2020 and has now been piloted with a number of different companies. We talked about the pilots themselves. We talked about how this is able to identify indicators that enable companies to prioritize actions and identify which sites they need to perhaps target for additional investigation or additional action, but also to highlight where they're performing well. You know, there has to be both sides of this. You have to understand when you are performing well, and then you can actually learn from that and apply that to other sites. We presented case studies both from Anglo American and from Total Energies, and learned some of the practical considerations to actually implementing this methodology. What did we learn when we picked this document up after it was published and tried to apply it, and how did we have to change it as a result? And then finally, we talked about how this can then feed into other different footprinting and indicator methodologies, and how it can feed into things like the Align project, which we talked about yesterday at the Hub, and potentially also feed into things like science-based targets. So that's what we did today. What we're going to do tomorrow, again, it's another action-packed day at the Hub. So we have our headline sessions relating to STAR, the Species Threat Abatement and Recovery metric, which will be launched both on the central stage at 11:15, Central Stage C for anyone who's here in person. But then also there will be a working session in the afternoon at 2 o'clock here at the Business and Nature Hub, which will go through how we actually practically can use this tool and start to understand its capabilities. And so here's the overall agenda. So tomorrow morning we'll start at 9:30 with a breakfast briefing, where we'll cover, again, what is going to happen in the day ahead. We will then have a session on science-based targets for nature. I think that's actually that's the wrong agenda, but never mind. So tomorrow morning, actually what we will have is a session on marine mitigation here at the Hub. We will then have the STAR session in the afternoon. And then if someone in the audience can remind me of what the final session of the day is. Anybody? Ah, there we go. No, that's... Yes, there we go. Yes, so we have then the Race to Zero session here at the Hub in the afternoon. And then finally, we will have in the evening, the last session of the day, we'll be combining public and private forces to apply natural capital accounting. So that's, again, another action-packed day. There will then be the wrap-up with Martin Locke from the Capitals Coalition. But on that note, I'll just open the floor to anyone who wants to make any final comments on the day and how they felt it went. Nobody? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, and hopefully we will see you again tomorrow morning.